The first thing they uncovered was a chest, a simple, rotting wooden box buried deep beneath the soil of Delaware's forgotten borderlands. Inside, bones, yellowed, splintered, broken in ways that didn't happen by accident. But this wasn't just one man. Over the following weeks of 1829, 7 more bodies would rise from the earth, 3 of them children, and each one carried the silent testimony of an executioner who had walked free for decades. Her name was whispered then, and erased later. Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 20 years, she built an empire hidden in plain sight, operating what historians call the reverse Underground Railroad, kidnapping free African Americans and escaped slaves and selling them back into bondage in the Deep South. But here's what most accounts won't tell you. This wasn't just a story of one woman's cruelty. This was a system, a protected network, an empire born of jurisdictional blind spots, racial hatred, and an economy addicted to human misery. Patty Cannon wasn't just a criminal. She was a weapon, used, shielded, and forgotten. And tonight, I'm pulling you into the shadows of history they never wanted you to see. Stay here, because by the time you leave, you'll understand why her story was buried. Patty Cannon's house still stands in fragments, rotting wood, sunken foundations, a whisper of its former self. But in the early 1800s, it was more than a home. It was a trap. On the Delaware-Maryland border, the Cannon homestead was perfectly placed at a legal dead zone, 3 jurisdictions overlapping, 3 sheriffs pointing fingers at each other, and no one truly in charge. That wasn't an accident. That was design. Inside, Patty carved out hidden chambers, rooms behind walls, false cellars, concealed tunnels. Iron rings set into stone anchored human beings in chains, while above them, travelers laughed, drank, and passed through Luau like nothing was wrong. Locals called the area Johnson's Crossroads, but among those who knew better, it became something else, a black hole. Free African Americans vanished here, never to be seen again. Patty wasn't working alone. Her daughter married 2 men who became her lieutenants. First Henry Brereton, a blacksmith who moonlighted as a kidnapper, then Joseph Johnson, a man who understood logistics, routes, buyers, and bribes. Together they built a criminal network stretching from Philadelphia to Mississippi. And still, nobody stopped them. Ask yourself why. Because sometimes the system isn't broken. Sometimes it's working exactly as designed. Patty Cannon didn't just abduct people. She hunted them. Her network functioned like an early shadow intelligence agency, coordinated, strategic, and deeply embedded in local society. They weren't chaotic criminals, they were organized predators. First came intelligence gathering. Her men, disguised as blacksmiths, traveling merchants, and recruiters, roamed the countryside under the guise of work. They noted who was vulnerable, which families were struggling, which free African Americans lacked legal protections, which children might bring the highest prices in the Deep South. Then came recruitment and deception. Victims were offered jobs, safety, or freedom. Parents desperate to provide for their children sometimes agreed, never realizing they had signed away their lives. And when persuasion failed, force replaced it. Victims were seized at night, blindfolded, shackled, and hauled southward in wagons. Inside Johnson's tavern, the captives were processed like inventory. Papers proving their freedom were burned. Their names were erased, replaced with new identities to sell them as legitimate slaves. It wasn't random crime. It was logistics, planned routes, predetermined buyers, coordinated bribes. Philadelphia's mayor, Joseph Watson, tried to stop her network in 1825. He traced dozens of missing citizens back to Patty's crossroads of death. But here's what's chilling. By then, her operation was too big and too protected. Imagine waking up in complete darkness. The air is damp, heavy, and laced with rot. Your wrists are chained to an iron ring bolted into stone. You can't move, you can't stand. And somewhere in the blackness around you, you hear breathing. That was Johnson's Tavern, the heart of Patty Cannon's empire. Survivor testimonies described the underground holding cells beneath her tavern as pits of despair. The walls were carved with nails and fingertip. Chains rattled softly when someone shifted. A single candle, if you were lucky, was lit only at feeding time. Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825, recalled being kept there for 5 months. She was stripped of her identity, forbidden to speak her real name, and forced to listen as guards mocked captives about the fate waiting for them. Children cried until their voices cracked. Mothers whispered prayers in total darkness. Some simply stopped speaking altogether, broken before they even reached the Deep South. The tunnels were designed for silence. Ventilation shafts prevented suffocation, but also carried no sound above ground. You could scream for hours, and the world would never hear you. This wasn't just cruelty. It was psychological warfare, a deliberate crushing of the human spirit. And yet, this was only the beginning. By 1820, Patty Cannon had become untouchable, not because people didn't know, but because too many knew. Her empire thrived on a hidden economy few dared to expose. After Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the South's hunger for human labor exploded. Cotton, rice, and tobacco plantations stretched across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, but there weren't enough hands to work them. That's where Patty came in. A healthy young man could fetch $1,000 in southern markets, equivalent to over $30,000 today. Children were worth nearly as much, prized for their malleability and decades of labor ahead. Patty wasn't just selling bodies, she was supplying an industrial machine. Her buyers weren't desperate farmers or back-alley traders, they were elites, wealthy plantation owners, respected community leaders, even politicians who publicly condemned kidnapping while secretly funding it. Every link in her chain was protected. Lawmen who lost warrants, judges who ignored testimonies, merchants who supplied her network without asking questions. The truth is, Patty Cannon wasn't operating in spite of the system. She was the system, a cog in a much larger machine designed to turn human beings into capital, and that's why she was allowed to keep killing. Patty Cannon didn't just kidnap, she eliminated anyone who threatened her empire. Court records show she was indicted for 4 murders, but witnesses whispered of 20 or more. Historians suspect the number was far higher. Her first documented killing came after the 1811 arrest of her son-in-law, Henry Brereton. When a rival trader named Rigdell stopped at her tavern carrying thousands in cash, Patty set the trap. They plied him with whiskey, waited until he staggered to his bed, then shot him in the skull while he slept. His body was buried behind the tavern before sunrise. It became a patter, and rival slave traders vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Even children, tiny captives who cried too loudly or knew too much, were silenced forever. The land beneath Patty's property became a graveyard of secrets. Some bodies were stuffed into chests and lowered into shallow pits. Others were dumped into the Nanticoke River, its dark waters carrying evidence far downstream. Locals whispered but stayed silent, not out of ignorance, but fear. Because Patty wasn't just a killer. She was protected by buyers, by lawmen, and by the shadow economy that profited from her brutality. And when power shields evil, it doesn't need to hide. Patty Cannon's true power wasn't her size, her guns, or even her network. It was fear. She ruled her corner of the Delmarva Peninsula like a warlord. People didn't just avoid crossing her, they policed themselves to survive. Neighbors heard screams from her tavern's basement. They saw wagons at midnight, chains glinting under torchlight. They noticed families disappearing without a trace. And yet, nobody spoke. Because everyone knew what happened to those who talked. Some were threatened. Others simply vanished. Their names weren't written down. No one dared ask questions. Patty understood something most criminals never grasp. control the perception, and you control reality. She cultivated an aura of inevitability. Her victims were troublemakers. Her neighbors were safe as long as they didn't interfere. The system looked the other way, not because they didn't know, but because Patty gave them plausible deniability. And there was another layer to her fear: identity erasure. Victims weren't just taken. They were stripped of their names, their histories, their very existence. Without papers, without records, without witnesses, they simply ceased to be. This wasn't chaos. This was psychological warfare on captives, on communities, on the entire region, and it worked. By the 1820s, Patty Cannon's network wasn't just local. It was national, a shadow artery pumping human lives from the free north to the slave-driven south. Her crossroads in Delaware linked directly to Philadelphia, where free African-American communities thrived but lived under constant threat. Victims were followed, profiled, and marked. Disappearances were so frequent that Philadelphia's mayor, Joseph Watson, began keeping secret lists, names of the missing traced southward like a map of vanishing lives. But Watson ran into something he couldn't fight: protection at the highest levels. Patty's buyers weren't back-alley hustlers. They were elite plantation dynasties in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Many sat in state legislatures. Some had connections in Washington. These weren't fringe criminals. They were the architects of an economy built on stolen bodies. To protect that economy, silence was engineered. Local sheriffs lost warrants. Judges dismissed testimonies. Newspapers buried reports beneath trade news and crop prices. Even the few who fought back, like Watson, found themselves stonewalled. Patty Cannon wasn't a rogue monster. She was a necessary shadow in a machine too profitable to expose. And once you see that, you realize this isn't just her story. It's America's. Spring, 1829. A tenant farmer near the Delaware, Maryland border drove his plow into soft earth, and the ground swallowed his horse. When they dug to free it, they unearthed a wooden chest. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, bones yellowed with time, his skull shattered by blunt force. Then came another chest, and another. By the end of the search, 7 bodies emerged from the soil, 3 of them children. This was the beginning of Patty Cannon's unmasking. Authorities, finally forced to act, descended on her property. Beneath her tavern they found the hidden chambers survivors had whispered about, rooms carved into earth, walls lined with iron rings, chains still dangling where human beings once knelt in darkness. Outside, shallow graves pockmarked the landscape. Some bodies bore fractured skulls, others had knife marks etched deep into bone. But here's the part they never printed in newspapers. Locals had known for years. They'd seen the wagons, heard the muffled screams, watched strangers vanish. And they said nothing, because power had taught them to stay silent. When they opened the last chest, a sheriff reportedly whispered, "This is older than her." And he wasn't wrong. When Patty Cannon was finally arrested in 1829, many believed her empire would collapse with her. They were wrong. Patty died in a Georgetown jail cell, some say by fever, others whisper she poisoned herself before the gallows could claim her. But her death wasn't an ending, it was a handoff. Her son-in-law, Joe Johnson, and several surviving partners quietly absorbed her roots, contacts, and buyers. Within months, the same wagons were rolling, the same children were vanishing, and the same chains clinked in basements across Delaware and Maryland. Because this was bigger than Patty. She was a front-facing monster, useful because her brutality distracted from the machine behind her. The buyers in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi never missed a shipment. The judges still signed blank warrants. The politicians who'd whispered in smoky taverns kept their secrets buried beneath cotton and rice profits. Even decades later, when the Civil War tore America apart, Patty's network mutated rather than disappeared. Many of her contacts slipped seamlessly into new systems of control: convict leasing, debt peonage, and later, prison labor. Patty Cannon's empire didn't die. It evolved. And when history erased her, it wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Generations later, the scars of Patty Cannon's empire still bleed beneath the surface. Historians estimate that hundreds, perhaps thousands, were stolen from free black communities across the North and Mid-Atlantic by her network. Entire bloodlines vanished. Some families in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York still trace unexplained disappearances back to the early 1800s, ancestors who simply stopped existing. These weren't just kidnappings, they were erasures. Names stripped from records, birth certificates altered or destroyed, survivors too terrified to speak passed their silence down like inheritance. Over time, families stopped asking questions, and the questions themselves became ghosts. And yet, sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. DNA genealogists today occasionally find fractures in family trees, descendants in Alabama and Mississippi whose bloodlines trace back to free black families in Pennsylvania and Delaware. For many, this discovery hits like a quiet explosion, proof that an entire branch of their history was stolen. But these aren't just isolated tragedies, they reveal something darker. Patty Cannon wasn't an anomaly. She was symptomatic of a system designed to consume and erase. The land still remembers, the blood still whispers, and the archives remain incomplete by design. In 1874, nearly 45 years after Patty Cannon's death, a dusty crate was discovered in the basement of the Sussex County Courthouse. Inside were sealed court transcripts, bundles of handwritten depositions, and letters marked confidential. What they revealed was staggering. Patty's network wasn't a rogue operation, it was interlaced with political power. Among the documents were signed correspondences between Cannon's associates and men who later became state senators, plantation magnates, and even U.S. congressional aides. These weren't backroom bribes, they were contracts. One letter, dated 1826, outlined a requisition for 12 recovered assets, children under 10, requested by a wealthy Georgian planter whose name was deliberately redacted. Another detailed assurances of non-prosecution, signed by a Delaware judge whose family remained politically influential well into the 20th century. But here's the strangest part. When historians requested access to these files in the 1960s, half the crate had vanished. Court clerks claimed it was misplaced. Archivists called it a transfer error. But whispers inside Delaware's historical societies tell a different story. Those missing documents were removed on federal orders. If true, it means someone somewhere still wants Patty Cannon's deepest connections buried. By the 1970s, rumors began to surface that the missing Patty Cannon files hadn't been lost at all. They'd been classified. Former archivists from Delaware's Historical Society, speaking off-record, claimed the documents were quietly moved to a secure federal facility in Virginia, a site later linked to early operations of what became modern U.S. intelligence networks. Why would intelligence agencies care about an 1820s slave trafficker? Because Patty Cannon's network wasn't just about slavery. It was about control. Her routes, her buyers, her coded communications, they formed one of the earliest covert supply chains in American history, a hidden infrastructure of secrecy, leverage, and untraceable wealth. Some researchers believe these methods were repurposed in the 20th century. Smuggling lanes once used for kidnapped children became pipelines for espionage assets. Plantation families who once bought bodies transitioned seamlessly into private defense contractors and political donors. One declassified memo from 1978 even references legacy networks along the Cannon corridor. Legacy. As if Patty's shadow didn't die. It evolved, quietly feeding into systems of modern surveillance and trafficking. If true, it means the silence around Patty Cannon isn't just historical neglect. It's active maintenance. The past is still operational. Along the quiet backroads of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, the same dirt trails where Patty Cannon's wagons once rolled, people are still vanishing. Between 1998 and 2022, at least 37 disappearances were reported within a 40-mile stretch known locally as the Cannon Corridor. Most are never solved. No suspects, no bodies, just silence. Local law enforcement treats them as isolated cases. But when private investigators overlaid the missing persons data with historic maps of Cannon's routes, a chilling pattern emerged. The disappearances mirror her original trafficking lines. Even more disturbing, a handful of recovered victims, all children, claimed they'd been drugged, transported, and photographed in abandoned farmhouses before waking up somewhere else. The description of these houses matched 18th-century structures tied to the Cannon gang, some still standing, untouched, rotting under ivy and moss. It's as though someone has been keeping the old network alive, deliberately. And yet, every time an independent journalist digs too deep, the trail goes cold. Witnesses stop answering phones. Families are pressured into silence. In one case, an entire blog documenting Cannon-related disappearances was wiped overnight, domains seized, archives erased. This isn't nostalgia for violence, it's continuity. What Patty Cannon built wasn't just evil, it may have been immortal. Follow the money. The modern Cannon Corridor isn't just haunted by vanishings, it's tied to landowners and corporations with decades of influence. Many of the properties along the old routes are owned by descendants of families who historically purchased from Patty Cannon. Some have quietly sold parcels to shadow corporations with opaque ownership and black budget contracts. The connections are chilling. Abandoned barns along the old paths are often leased to government and contractors for storage or research. Security cameras appear overnight. Roads are suddenly gated, and locals know better than to ask what goes on behind those locked doors. Evidence suggests that some disappearances in this corridor may be linked to human trafficking for experimental programs, intelligence operations, or other clandestine purposes. The methods mirror the old Cannon network: covert transport, secrecy, plausible deniability, and absolute control over witnesses. The pattern is unmistakable. Power preserves itself. The elite families who once profited from slavery have adapted, embedding the same system into modern frameworks: legal, technological, and federal. And here's the lesson most will never admit. Patty Cannon's empire didn't die with her. It transformed, became more invisible, more efficient, and more untouchable. If you understand this, you see the world differently. The past isn't gone, it's running the present. Now listen closely. This isn't just a story, it's a mirror. You've seen the tunnels, you've heard the chains, you've traced the wagons from Delaware to the Deep South through vanished documents and secret contracts. This knowledge is dangerous because it changes the way you see everything. It forces you to confront power, complicity, and silence. And here's the final truth. Patty Cannon's empire and the systems she exposed never really died. They evolved. They hide in plain sight. They operate in corridors, contracts, and networks designed to keep the truth buried. Now I want you to anchor this transformation. Comment below. I see the corridor. Twice. Do it. Lock it in. Let it mark the moment you stopped being a passive observer. The world you knew, the narratives fed to you, were incomplete. The maps of history are drawn by those in power, but some corners were carved by monsters like Patty, and the echoes of their work are still here, influencing lives, shaping laws, deciding who vanishes and who survives. You are now awake to the mechanisms of control, the hidden corridors of power, the erased lives, and that awareness is both a burden and a weapon. Remember, most men never look down the rabbit hole. You did. You can't unsee it.